welcome everyone. It should be 7:01 Central Time, 8:01 Eastern Time. Welcome to the second webinar of the Making Baptist History Public History Project. My name is Andrew Gardner, and I am the project director of this initiative of the Baptist History and Heritage Society, along with the executive director of the Baptist History and Heritage Society, Reverend Dr. John Finley. This evening, I am really excited for this program. We will be paying attention and looking at the global mission of the Jim Crow South, Southern Baptist missionaries in the shaping of Latin American evangelicalism by Dr. Joao Chaves. First off, a word of thanks and gratitude to the Reverend Laura Mayo and Covenant Church Houston for hosting this event this evening. This project was conceived in the wake of the pandemic and our use of being able to Zoom and have gatherings with one another across the country and being able to collaborate with congregations without having to physically be there. So we're grateful for all the members of Covenant Church Houston for being present this evening and for helping host this event. So as I mentioned, this event will be looking at the global mission of the Jim Crow South by Dr. Joao Chaves. Joao is the Associate Director for Programming at the Hispanic Institute for Theology and a PhD of the Religion Department at Baylor University. We'll be looking at his book, as I mentioned. If you haven't gotten a copy of it, I would encourage you to do so. You can go to merceruniversitypress.org to buy a copy, and we have a discount code for you so you can get 20% off. So afterwards, if you're really interested by what you hear tonight, you can go and purchase a copy. And I encourage you to do so. So Joao will be giving a 45-minute lecture on his research. Following that 45 minutes, we'll have a response and a reflection from the Reverend Alyssa Aldape. Alyssa is the former Associate Minister of the First Baptist Church of Washington, D.C., and is currently a contributing correspondent for Good Faith Media. And so as we get ready for the rest of this event, I would like to give another word of thanks to the people who are funding this event. So the Making Baptist History Public History Project has been made possible in part by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan in partnership with the American Historical Association. And any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this webinar do not necessarily represent those of the American Historical Association, the NEH, or the Baptist History and Heritage Society for that matter. As many Baptists know, that with one Baptist, you have at least 3 or 4 opinions. So, we're not going to be holding the American Historical Association or the NEH or the Baptist History and Heritage Society to anything that's said tonight. I'd like to ask that you keep yourselves muted throughout the program. During the question and answer period, you can use the raise hand feature under reactions to be called upon to ask your question. And so following Alyssa's response, we'll open it up for question and answers. And then at the conclusion of the program, I'll give some information on our upcoming webinar that will be in July. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Joao. Let's see.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Really appreciate that. Thank you to the Baptist History and Heritage Society for putting this together, especially Andrew and John, who have been good friends, who've worked I admire for some time, and Alyssa as well for the response, and Laura and her congregation for hosting this. So I'll share the screen here in just a minute. Do I have the ability to do that? Let me see here. Yeah, I'm good. So I'll share here in just a minute, but I would like to tell a story first that I tell in the book, in the beginning of the book, which happened when I was doing research for my previous book, Migrational Religion. I was in the East Coast interviewing Brazilian Baptist pastors in the United States, which is what that particular research is about, Brazilian immigrant churches. And I asked how they saw the relationship between Brazilian, the Brazilian Baptist Convention and the Southern Baptist Convention. And one of them told me a story that I think that encapsulates kind of that relationship. He said it humorously, jokingly, When Southern Baptists sneeze, Brazilian Baptists catch a cold, he said. Right? So I thought it was a very interesting and perceptive way of saying, meaning that even when it is not the intention of the Southern Baptist Convention to influence Brazilian Baptists, and I would broaden that to Brazilian evangelicalism in general, although with some notable exceptions and qualifications, that influence has been historically very significant, and we'll show a little bit why. And it is kind of the way in which that influence was introduced, established, and maintained within the first 100 years of the life of the Brazilian Baptist Convention is the kind of major historical focus of the book. But other interests kind of surround that history as well, and I want to mention some of them as we discuss here in the next few minutes. And also some more contemporary concerns like the creation of the religious right, the geopolitical, the significance of that story to that particular event, especially, and those were kind of concerns that they were always kind of in the purview of my research agenda and interest, even if not very directly addressed in the book, some of them more than others, especially as I have finished the book during the Trump and Bolsonaro era, when both would celebrate each other every chance they got, and that kind of course, informed the way in which I approach some of these topics as well. So let me share the screen here, and so we can just summarize some of the major points here of the book, and then go from there. Hopefully to some discussion afterwards. Here we go. All right, so can everybody see this? Yeah, okay. All right, so in terms of just a brief roadmap of what we're hopefully going to do here, let me fix my screen. All right. So first, I would like to start with general themes and questions, just rather than put kind of implications at the end. I'll talk about some of them in the beginning, so that hopefully the kind of broader significance of what I at least would hope the broader significance of this particular history is it's front and center as we discuss the specifics of the book. So we'll talk about what some of those are in terms of some methodological concerns, some of the topics that end up being touched in the book, even if not, always being central to the story, but is always there in one way or the other. So I'll mention what some of those are. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the context, both in terms of academic discussions, but also demographic shifts. In which the book was written, and it is in part of these concerns in terms of the conversation that I hope it begins to engage. And then I'll dive into the book proper, give a general timeline of what the 100 years that the major point in the 100 years that I attempt to trace here of history in this book. And then I will kind of go through kind of 4 major moves within the book that I think reveal some of the topics, or the major topic that I want to talk about here, which is the racialized controlling disposition of Southern missionaries in Latin America, but Brazil in particular, and how that affected the locals that were appropriated, the particular message, to different extents. And then, after that, have some concluding thoughts, and then we'll hear from Alyssa's, and hopefully after that we'll have some discussion. So in terms of general themes and questions that are touched in the book, and I'm not going to focus on all of those as we continue our talk here, but I will focus on some. But I would like to mention, so that some of the topics that again are either directly addressed in the book or are in the background. In one of those topics, and each one of these, one of those of you who are, historians as I am, know the challenges of writing 100 years, is that every little topic that you touch, potentially has a whole bibliography and academic discussion of its own, which is true for many of those here. So I'll talk about migration of Confederate exiles. I'll say a little bit more about what that is in a minute. But basically that refers to Southerners who go to Brazil after they lose, the American Civil War. Brazil remained a slaveholding country for 23 more years after the war was over in the US. I'll talk about missionary racial imagination in the book. There's a major theme there. And connected to that, the globalization of lost cause mythology. Those of you who are here in this webinar series for the last presenter, Chris Moore, heard more about the lost cause mythology, which is one of the streams of memory that comes after the Civil War, that kind of sacralizes the memory of the South as this place of moral superiority and also white supremacy. Then I'll talk about the dynamics between missionary correspondence or in private performance and missionary publications and public performance. And here's a kind of a theme that I keep on going back to in the book, both in terms of kind of methodological concerns, but also how it shows up in the story. It strikes me that a lot of history of missions and history of missionary activity is often based on either missionary self-perception or public documents that are intended for broader audiences, sometimes audiences of mixed race, as it was the case of the audiences of Southern Baptist missionaries in Brazil. But in the case of this group in particular, if you look at the private correspondence or the missionary correspondence of private performances, if you look at, to be a little more blunt, if you look at white-only interactions and the freedom that these Southerners have in those interactions, and compare to their public performances that they know are going to be consumed and witnessed by mixed-race groups in foreign countries, like Brazil in this case, at times, those tell radically different stories. So I mentioned, I tease out a little bit of methodological implications of that for this particular work in the book, but also show the trick being done, right? Missionaries are saying, one thing in public, but one very different thing in private very often. And we'll look at some quotes here of missionaries in Brazil, of what missionary publications in the US are saying, and then what Brazilians are saying at the same time to see how they contrast and compare. So I drew out some quotes from the book here from primary sources as the conversation develops, so we can kind of have an example of those dynamics. And with that, I also talk about another theme is the role of local agency and importance of multilingual research. I'll say a little more about that. In conversations within the academy and the literature in world Christianity, for good reason, oftentimes local agency is emphasized as almost a conversation stopper. It is taken as this, in some approaches anyway, as the manifestation of some kind of almost indigenous or highly adaptable form of Christian practice. In this group particularly, when you talk about Baptists or Brazilian Baptists, local agencies was often, I claim in the book anyway, exercise as the choice to imitate, right? and to praise, Southern Baptists in the United States, oftentimes as the only or superior loci of authentic Christianity, and I think that's problematic in some ways. I'll talk about, Baptist, the consolidation of Brazilian national identity in the book. I will not mention that anymore, but but it's important to note that it was former Baptist Gilberto Freire, who was a Baylor graduate, went to Baylor University in the beginning of the 20th century, via his connections to missionaries in Recife, Brazil. Then he left Baptist after that. When he goes back to Baylor in the 1980s, he says that's partially because of the rabid racism that he witnessed in Texas when he was there. He ends up going to Columbia to study with Jewish anthropologist Franz Boas, goes back to Brazil and becomes one of the most influential intellectuals. And his idea of Brazil as a racial democracy, as a place where miscegenation resolves the sharper edges of racism, really picks up, and is even, that idea is even oftentimes influenced legislation during the Brazilian dictatorship and beyond. In ways that today is recognized to be not helpful, and to actually hide some of the racial issues, or the ability of people to diagnose the racial issues in Brazil, which is one of the largest quote unquote black countries in the world. Depending on how you think about race, Brazil can be considered the second largest black country in the world, second only to Nigeria, partially because of the transatlantic slave trade. And Gilberto Freire kind of offers an intervention there that is not, that at the end of the day, it's not very helpful in diagnosing racial tension. And again, that history is connected to the history of Baptist missions as well. So we have the Southern Baptist Convention and the development of Brazilian national identity in terms of racial imagination as surprising and unintended partners. And as I argue in the book, not only the manifestation, but the maintenance of white supremacy in that country. And again, and missionary support of dictatorships. I talk about the religious right in the book, or the transnational religious right. And talk about global Pentecostalism and how it was introduced by Baptist missionaries also in corners of Brazilian Baptist history. And I also mention in the book, I don't develop this a whole lot, but I kind of question this sharp distinction between evangelical and evangelical, which some scholars make. And I understand why they do it in this particular group. And I think this has broad explanatory kind of power for other groups as well. It seems that that distinction sometimes is too sharp. Some groups are evangelical, not only, despite the terminological complications of that term and how highly debated it is, some groups are evangelical, even in Latin America, in ways that resemble the evangelicals here, in very close ways, in ways that it explains more to just consider them to be evangelical than to make a distinction between evangelical and evangelical, which is this notion that Latin American evangelicals are, by and large or primarily, conservative theologically, but progressive socially. I find that to be problematic in some ways. Right? So those are some of the things that the book kind of touches, and I know they are not systematically shared here, but I thought I would just share them and now focus on some of the more particular historical contributions in terms of the historical narrative of the book. And another thing that was very important to me to mention in the beginning of the book as well is this reminder that the shift of the center of gravity of Christianity has changed from the global north to the global south, with Latin America, Africa, and Asia being major centers of the religion today. I focus on the connection between Brazil and the US, which are the two countries with the largest number of Christians in the world today and are projected to be in those positions in decades to come. But again, it's important to know and to remember that the fact that despite the struggles that US Christianity has faced in terms of demographic shifts and the possibilities, a lot of the maintenance and even the corners of growth of US Christianity, many times created by migration from places like Latin America or the growth of the Hispanic population here. So the maintenance of the numeric strength of Christianity in the US is informed by the fact, that migration from Latin America and Hispanic population in the US kind of help stabilize those numbers to a certain extent. So all of that to say that it is important to learn the history of these groups because North American Christianity or US Christianity is becoming increasingly informed via migration and via the growth of Latinx populations by the Christian expressions that often have roots in places like Brazil, in other countries of the region. So in terms of the significance of the work for US Christianity, I think is important to know that. And I know that's in addition to, just the historical gap that I hope the book kind of fills. So I began looking at missionaries that were actually migrants. The category between missionary and migrants sometimes is blurred. And here, definitely, you have Confederate exiles going to Brazil. That's where the sustainable phase of Baptist missions in Brazil began in Confederate enclaves in the country. Very soon, you have Brazilian missionaries sending white Brazilian men, what they call Portuguese, to study in the segregated South. So you see that the mentality of the Confederacy is established and maintained via, different and differentiated and multiple means here. Confederates or former Confederates or Southern missionaries go to Brazil already being socialized in that mentality, but they also send the future leaders of the denomination to appropriate that mentality via theological education in the South, right? In the segregated South. Many of the leaders of those who were intended to be the leaders of the Brazilian denomination, the local leaders, studies in places like Southern Theological Seminary, and some of them go to Brazil and then go back to the United States and work for the Home Mission Board and other places. And again, those are the strongest partnerships with locals in terms of leadership that missionaries kind of establish. Again, introducing the leaders to the theological education in the South that is done from within that very Southern, mentality that, again, is also expressed in Brazil via the missionaries themselves, who go there having been socialized in those places in a particular period. Many of them, are either have mentors or have been self-participating one way or another in the struggles of the Civil War and what came soon after that. Very soon in the 20th century, already in 1907, the Brazilian Baptist Convention is established. 1908, the World Mission Board, the Brazilian Baptist Convention, begins sending missionaries to other places. Chile is the first place. Portugal is the second one. The whaling industry in the US attracts Portuguese migrants who go to the East Coast, who go to California, and then Baptist missionaries in Portugal, Portuguese missionaries who have been working in cooperation with the Brazilian missionaries in the country and come also to the US, to minister to these populations in the East Coast. So you already see the multi-directionality in the movement across borders that goes to the global South, from the global North to the global South, from the global South to the global North, from the global South to the global South. It goes from everywhere to everywhere. So this idea of reverse missions have been complicated, by scholars like Afi Adogami and others, who want to say that mission is really from very early on multi-directional. It goes from different places to different places at the same time. By the time I end the narrative of the book in 1982, when the Brazilian Baptist Convention celebrates 100 years. The World Missionary Board already has missionaries in many places in Africa, all over Latin America, other places in Europe like Spain and France, they already sent missionaries to the US, to those very, Portuguese enclaves that now we have a second wave of Iberian Portuguese migration, and then to Canada as well. And then today, with the growth of the Brazilian Baptist Convention that continues to grow, then more countries were added to that missionary dynamic. And with the new Immigration Act of 1965, where the doors to enter the United States have been open to different parts of the world, people from these places also come here. And so it's very complex relationships, transnational relationships that happen physically with people actually moving across border from place to place, but also with the growth of social media technologies, it develops and it spreads in diversified means. But in terms of the general outline of the book, and I won't spend much time here because I do want to save some time for discussion. I consider this from 1845, when, because of the issue of slavery, the Southern Baptist Convention really begins. I start with 1882. That's the year that in terms of Brazilian Baptist issue that some consider to be the start. That's when William Buck Bagby arrives in Brazil. He arrives in 1881, but 1882, he starts the first church that is directed to locals, and go all the way to 1982, when the Brazilian Baptist Convention celebrates 100 years. And so you just have some highlights there, and I can show this again in the discussion time if it becomes relevant to any of you. And then, the kind of four motions that the book makes in terms of the periodization, right? So I periodize that in basically kind of four steps that I think help us kind of understand, the way in which Southern missionaries, particularly Southern Baptist missionaries, again, introduce and maintain their influence in Brazil, not only in terms of institutional control, but also in terms of the formation of a certain imagination. So the first phase, from 1881, that's when William Buck Bagby arrives, and he goes to one of those Confederate colonies very soon. To 1936 is when I trace kind of this transition from missionary control to nationalization. Right, and there we see the implementation of Baptist white supremacy and neocolonialism. And by that, I mean this notion of Southern white missionaries who really show how they think they are racially superior to the Brazilian population in general, but particularly the mixed population. Is interesting to see that the worst instances of white supremacy and racist dispositions that missionaries show in terms of how they talk about Brazilians, it's not against who they call Africans or Black Brazilians or Afro-Brazilians, but it is when they address mixed people of mixed blood, people like me, for example, I have a Black mother now. A Black father and white mother. Those folks, they really, of course, they preferred white, male, middle class, if they could get one, converts. They thought those were really set naturally to be the leaders of the denomination. That's the people who they send to study in the US. They support as leaders of churches and denominations. But very often you see them doing a hierarchy of races where you have the white men, on top, whom often they call the Portuguese. Then you have the blacks, or African blacks, who they call blacks of pure stock sometimes. But then the miscegenated population for them is the lowest. They represent all kinds of physical, and also, mental limitations, and that really comes through. So we have these structural partnerships with white male locals as ideal second tier of leadership, right? Where they benefit from the privileges of being the preferred from the missionaries. They got scholarships to US institutions. They get, some positions of leadership that dark-skinned Brazilian, black and brown Brazilians do not in the same way. Then you have during that phase also the formalization of theological training and denominational polity. And theological training is done, in ways that very intentionally resemble education in the South. The publication houses either published books written by the missionaries themselves or translate books being used in the US. That translation practice remains today. You have that. I just talked to a pastoral friend of mine, that mentioned that, in ordination processes in Brazil. Now, when I go there, I see this too. Translated books by folks like Wayne Grudem, for example, even when they are not the ones being used in the seminary, although some still use it. They are used for the ordination process. That's what the kind of theology that you need to know. I mean, that practice remains, but started like that as well. And they have a centralized denominational publication, which is very important for different reasons. There's home and foreign fields being developed in Latin America and Europe, during this phase. And then also characterized by rabid anti-Catholicism. And here, just I'll speed up here a minute because we'll be out of time otherwise. But I do want to just show a few examples of, from missionaries in Brazil. So here are two. William Buck Bagby, and as a Baylor graduate myself, I've walked on Bagby Street many times over there in Waco, one pioneer. And you see really there, and I won't read all of those, how lowly he thought about Brazilians in general, but particularly non-white Brazilians, or Brazilians who are not Portuguese, as they often called, white Brazilians. You have Z.C. Taylor there, saying that the Negro in Brazil, as everywhere, lives for the present, as the Chinese lives in the past, and the Caucasian for the future. So that's kind of encapsulate that sense. Taylor very explicitly denied to marry couples of mixed race in Brazil, because according to his imagination, that would not, of course, be best practice for the love of the couple itself, but primarily for the love of the children, who will be miscegenated and therefore even more lesser than. At the same time, if you look at what U.S. Missionary publications are publishing in here, you really also see, the kind of rabid anti, miscegenation and that happens there. So an editor at Home and Foreign Fields there, and I'll read this second quote that kind of encapsulates that. And sometimes, some Catholic, publications in Brazil pick up on this and they start translating that into Portuguese and publishing in newspapers so that the population can see what these Americans really think, right? So it's really interesting dynamic, and I show that in the book in at least one or a couple of ways. So you see that, at the end there, I talk about miscegenation here in the US, and oftentimes looking at Latin America, and saying, look, that happened in Latin America and it was terrible. They're not thinking about Brazil, which is the largest beachhead of Baptist presence in the country, highly miscegenated country. And you see that at the end of that quote on the bottom, that the editor there says, and this is published in the 1920s, the standards of both, when miscegenation happens, the standards of both races are lowered, the purity of the racial stock is destroyed, and irreparable harm done to both peoples. No catastrophe to the human race could be quite comparable to the loss of racial integrity of the American white people. You said that, examples like that, and I show several of them going on. At the same time, you have Brazilians doing that in the 1930s, fighting for autonomy. Those Brazilians that lead that group are all trained in the US, Baylor and Southern Seminary. and they really want to be independent, to be autonomous. They want to administer their own funds. And at the same time, the missionaries are weakened by the fact that the Great Depression is happening in the United States, and they really cannot have the outcome they need, because a lot of the missionaries who are in furlough in the US, the convention doesn't have the money to send them back, and they don't have the money to fund the organizations in Brazil in the same way. So it really becomes like a perfect storm for locals to get some control. And Adrião Bernardes, who's a Baylor graduate, and becomes the first president of a break-off from the Brazilian Baptist Convention. Later, they rejoin when the locals get some autonomy and begin leading the denomination or major denomination institutions. So in his presidential address on that first year of that break-off, he says, no, I just want to, we just want to be just like the missionaries have trained us to be. We really want to do the work that we know we can do, that they trained us to do. And then he says, this quote that I think encapsulates kind of the resentment that has been built. And he says, if they, or the missionaries, were human creatures like us, vulnerable to errors, suspicions, misunderstandings, faults, and sins, we would have a common base with which we could work. But they're extraordinary creatures, sui generis, infallible, invulnerable, and even imponderable and inaccessible, with authority superior to that of the churches of Christ, escaping even the administration. What can we do with such creatures? Right? So here, the kind of going back to the missionaries who end up being kicked out of many of these churches and even of some seminary positions, and saying, you told us that the local church is autonomous. You told us that, that the autonomy of the local church, whatever the church decides and the churches in cooperation decide goes. All these churches decide that they want a transition of leadership. But then when that happens, you resist, right? So he's trying to tease out some of the inconsistencies between, the talk or the articulated commitments of these missionaries and what they actually do in practice. A couple of between 1936 and 1938, we have the leadership of the denomination moves to Brazilians. But then after 1938, the missionaries really begin systematically regain control of the denomination, and then they focus on seminaries, publishing houses, and periodicals become really the center of missionary power in Brazil in very intentional ways. And they do that for a few reasons, partially because they know that those are the most influential institutions in the denomination. And they also know that with the denomination growing, the ratio between missionaries and locals, will diminish, will change. So the center of power becomes, these institutions more than before. At the same time, we have a turn, in Brazilian culture towards a more pro-American stance. So they find less cultural resistance as well. The denomination continues to grow during this period. But then we have a closer policing of ideological commitment of local leaders. After the radical movement, after you have that transition of power that is kind of, forced onto the missionaries for different reasons, they begin limiting who they send to the US on scholarships. They begin being a lot more careful and systematic about which Brazilians they choose to lead the denomination. And you really see that in who the process that they put in place to send people to train in the US, and also how they maneuver behind the scenes to choose pro-missionary leaders to head organizations and the most important boards of the denomination. Again, those are almost exclusively during this period exclusively, but throughout history, almost exclusively white men. And that trend continues in like I mentioned a minute before, one of the blackest countries in the world. And you see that just missionaries, first just the crying that and upset that the leadership has changed, and then in the 50s you already see the secretary there of the Foreign Mission Board celebrating that the fine Christian spirit of Southern missionaries won out and they are now back in control, which they were. And then after 1945 to 1982, when I talk about the last kind of period there, you see this transition from this strategic missionary control to gradual nationalization. Now, in 1982, when I finished the narrative of the book, there is still one Southern Baptist missionary who is the president of a major theological seminary. The faculties in the seminaries are still very much, feeling the presence of missionaries. The books were still that are assigned for theological training are, by and large, still written by Southern Americans and on and on. But the denomination grows, and there is more administrative autonomy, certainly. And you see that growth there in the different countries to which the World Mission Board of the Brazilian Baptist Convention send missionaries. We also have the first, Latin American president of the Baptist World Alliance in Brazil is Joao Chaves, who is the son of Francisco Fulgêncio Sorin, who was a mentee of Bagby, who was a graduate of Southern Seminary. Joao Sorin was also a graduate of U.S. institutions. Some of you might also know the name of Nilson Fanini, who later becomes the president of the Baptist World Alliance. And when the dictatorship, of course, I should say the Baptist World Alliance meets in Brazil in 1960. Billy Graham goes there. It is a very kind of important and memorable statement of the presence of Protestantism in the country, even at that date. And with the dictatorship being established in 1964, you really have, this close relationship between these leaders, Baptists among them, and the dictators. As a matter of fact, the growth of Protestantism in Brazil today, is some demographers project that by 2032, Brazil will become a majority Protestant country, which in my own lifetime, when I'm growing up in Brazil, that would be, hard to imagine. But part of that growth is sometimes traced back to the privileges that were given to, a few Protestant initiatives in Brazil, and Baptists among them, during the dictatorship that's trying to fight off the progressive elements within the Roman Catholic Church. Here I'm thinking about liberation theology, basic leisure communities, and some progressive bishops like Dom Helder Câmara, who was bishop of my city. They really fight against the dictatorships. Protestants were, a lot more embracing of that. Missionaries celebrated the dictatorship when it was established. And Brazilian Baptists likewise saw it as a very positive thing, and they benefited from those 21 years of dictatorship, sometimes more than others, but certainly this, somebody like Nilson Fanini, who again was the president of the Baptist World Alliance, had a very close relationship to the dictators, and other folks as well. As a matter of fact, one of the folks that one former American missionary, was a son of a missionary too in Brazil, was interviewed for my other book that I mentioned in the beginning, Migration and Religion, and I did not account for this in that book or in this one. Talking to him at one point, and he's a pastor here in the US today, he's still active. At one point he said, that some of the folks, and some of the friends of his fathers were closed to, presidents during the dictatorship, and the dictators served as translators when US dignitaries were there. and we are always in close relationship to that. So, and there are many stories that could be told of those relationships. The praise for the dictatorships when it is established, and of course it is, a dictatorship that, as many others in the US, has been established with influence of the United States, is really celebrated by missionaries in their correspondence, explicitly so. And you see the picture of dictators, in the periodicals next to some missionaries and Brazilian Baptist leaders. That really happens during that period as well. And also, of course, there is with the growth of Pentecostalism in Brazil, there is some competition there. There was a sense of anti-Pentecostalism that also develops. And that's a complicated history that I tell also in the book. I dedicate one chapter to that. And then, in terms of global Christianity or migration, particularly, we have also the Brazilian Baptist churches in the US beginning to grow in the 1980s with a first wave of mass migration to the country. And that story I do tell also in another book. And here you have João Chaves Pereira, who was a very influential editor, seminary professor, president, talking about, how the missionaries from North America, brought Brazilians the gospel. So of course, we just use their methods and their convictions. And then what I do not do in the book very systematically, but at least in terms of our conversation here, I do mention it in the introduction, but in terms of our conversation here, what happens then, you see kind of the gradual nationalization to religious rights, theopolitics. And here I'll just plug in, the importance of a book that I think goes hand in hand with mine. Mine stops at that one, roughly where that one begins, which is Ben Cowan's Moral Majority Across the Americas, in which he argues that the Christian right, or the religious right as we see it today, both in the US and in other places, was created hand in hand between Brazil and the US, particularly during the dictatorship. And I think there is a lot, to that argument. But again, within the last 40 years, we've seen, majority support of socially conservative politics and politicians. One digression from the Southern Baptist Convention is that some states in the Brazilian Baptist Convention recognize the ordination of women, but that's still very controversial and practiced in precarious ways. You see the continuous goals of denomination, partnership with Southern Baptist institutions is still this practice of sending leaders to train here continues, and it really is expanding, as a matter of fact. And then the curriculum for training pastors, the seminary curriculum, remains overdetermined by Southern Baptist shadow. And you have Daniel Aiken there, a quote from him, and he was the chairman of the 6 seminary presidents who signed recently, some of you might remember this statement against critical race theory and intersectionality. There's a quote I used in the book that Southeastern loves the Great Commission partnership, and Brazilian Baptists, are one that they cherish the most. We are 2 partners in building God's kingdom, throughout the years. And I mentioned that and showed in the book. You have different, Southern Baptist leaders praising Brazil as like the new Antioch, or a place that sends missionaries. So that partnership has always been really celebrated on both ends of this relationship. And then so in that, and I'll end here. I think I made it on time here, so I still have like 3 minutes. In terms of the complexity of the story, and I think the contemporary importance of the story beyond, filling some gaps in the literature, which lots of these books are designed to do, in terms of World Christianity, the history of US evangelicalism, and the history of missions, that I think that my book kind of navigates within that intersection. I think that it is important to realize the global importance of the history, or how the Southern Baptist Convention it has really been a global powerhouse in ways that the local expression of foreigners or people in other countries that have adopted that part, or have been reached by Southern Baptist Convention, sometimes develop in ways that strengthen that influence rather than qualify it, right? And here I go back to the evangelical distinction. In terms of the Brazilian Baptist Convention, that's now, by and large, again, a strong support of Bolsonaro, who many call the Brazilian Trump. You'll see him there with his Roman Catholic, but his wife is Baptist. He preached and spoke. I should say spoke, not really preached, in Baptist pulpits and churches, and has been celebrated and continues to be celebrated by many Baptists in Brazil, but also in the US. You see the Confederate colonies there, that those pictures are from Brazil. They still celebrate the Confederacy. And also missionaries, Brazilian missionaries in Africa, also, doing work there. So the way in which Southern Baptist influence continues to spread around the world sometimes does not look, like a white American man with the Bible under, his forearm, under his armpit, but it is sometimes disseminated by locals like Brazilian Baptists, who have really appropriated the ideology, the social imagination, and other aspects of the Southern Baptist Convention, but they have immense global influence, and also migrate to the US, as not necessarily missionaries, but practitioners of a form of evangelical Christianity that is very closely related to the way in which it expresses itself here by members of the Southern Baptist Convention. So I'll end with that, and I very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Joao. That is just so interesting. I just absolutely love your work. I will turn it now over to Alyssa for response, reflection, and questions.
Thank you so much, Joao, for your work. And thank you to the Baptist History and Heritage Society for this opportunity to participate and offer my reflections on the work of global missions of the Jim Crow South. This lecture series was created, as they mentioned, to promote historical thinking among the wider public. And as a pastor and historian, and more importantly, as a Baptist Latina, understanding the roots of my faith and our collective faith and of my community has never been more important to me than now. In fact, Joao's notes at the very beginning of the first president, at the beginning of his book, he mentions the very first president of the Hispanic Baptist Convention of Texas. And he writes that the very first president of the Hispanic Baptist Convention was a white Baptist leader with KKK sympathies. The very first president of the Hispanic Baptist Convention of Texas was a white Baptist leader with KKK sympathies. So one can make the argument that any decade is the time to understand our history. And I can say that same argument for now. And so before we begin, I'd like to invite us to do a small exercise. I am a historian first, but more importantly, I am a Baptist youth pastor at heart. And one of the practices that I would do with my youth before we got into any work and understanding scripture or understanding a Sunday school lesson is that I invited them to understand the context and lenses in which they understood the world around them. Because for many of us, that is essentially how we interpret scripture, right? Is how the lenses that we use to understand and make sense of it all. Now, so before I begin, I'd like you to pause for just a second and think about the lenses in which you interpret the world around you, how you interpret scripture, and for today's webinar, how you interpret history. So if you have a pen and some paper, I'd like you to write those down. Let's just take a minute to think about those. I trust you to keep writing if you're not done. But to give you an understanding of how I understand the world around me, I am the product of the Hispanic Baptist Convention and Churches of Texas. While the people in the pews and the pastor around me looked like me, the Jesus in the stained glass did not. The Jesus in Sunday school lessons and in curriculums looked more like the white pastors that I would watch on TV on Sunday mornings with my dad. It was these churches that I knew that God was love and that God loved me. But it was also in these holy places in which our religious heritage was also tied to a denomination deeply rooted in the protection and praise of whiteness. That is to say that I could try my best to be a good Baptist, to be saved by the age of 6, to be baptized by the age of 10, memorize the Roman road, commit every hymn and corito by heart, but ultimately could not attain the prize because I was not, nor am I, white. I'm also the child of missionaries. And so my working understanding of mission and experience of mission is constantly in tension. And I am also a millennial who has long been separated, or so I've thought, from the Southern Baptist Convention and culture of white Southern practice. Again, or so I've thought. So these are the contexts in which I read and understand Joao's work. And thank you again, Joao. I know I've mentioned already, every time I read something profound, I made my fiance listen to it and kind of ruminate with me. So again, this is the understanding in which, or the context is in which I read his work. And so much of my understanding of faith were in these pages of what it meant to be a good Baptist. We're not only reading history that has happened long ago, but we are reading essentially the foundation and model in which the predecessors operate in. That is to say that as cooperative Baptists or an alliance of Baptists, we cannot separate ourselves from the foundations created by the Southern Baptists. And to deny that is to deny our foundation in white supremacy in history. Joao writes that our history is often romanticized and sensationalized by those who have the power to write it, and often, as we have discovered in the last couple of weeks, covered up by those in power. And so in reading his work, it has been a challenge to me to recognize the ways that we have romanticized our history and have never truly, and have often not asked ourselves, who are those that don't get to explain the narrative? And so a couple of my takeaways, as Joao has mentioned, one of them was that as a journalist, throughout reading his works, it has become I'm very aware of how important journals and press were in the understanding and how they controlled the narrative in Brazil. And so as a faith-based journalist, I'm aware that this is also important in how we write today, including any type of faith-based news source. And another takeaway is that one of the understanding and influence of Christian culture and practice was heavily influenced by white Southern Baptist understanding and practice, which makes me wonder even further and grieve the imagination of what an organic and local Christian faith would have looked like had it not been for a heavily white Southern Baptist influence. My third takeaway from his work is that throughout his writing, Joao speaks about the power and the struggle for power within the history of Baptists in Brazil. And I'm left again processing his work in the context of the denominations that I've grown up in and the denominations that I've been raised in, and understanding how we ourselves use power and understand power. And so I am left with these understandings and processing these things. I have 3 questions for Joao, and I'd like to move it on for others to ask as well. But these are the 3 that I'm kind of sitting with now as I continue to process not just the history of Brazil, Baptists in Brazil, but in a sense, Baptists or Latina Baptists, not just in South America, but also in the United States. My first question, I'd like to quote a passage from page 111. And so the quote is this: the pro-missionary side of the struggle counted with their new periodical, the Correio Doctrinal, I apologize for butchering the Portuguese, in order to disseminate its anti-radical propaganda. Further down, they say that, where to go? One of the main ways in which the pro-missionary establishment attempted to undermine radicals meaning locals who yearned to also be co-laborers in this work, by way of connecting radical sensibilities to what they thought was a theopolitical threat to true New Testament Christianity: anti-individualism. This anti-individualism had a number of ramifications, is when manifested in the unspoken commitments of radicals and their sympathizers. In the first issue of the publication, an anonymous article argued that the radical movement was founded on the principle of class solidarity, and that class solidarity was not only the doctrinal basis and organizing principle of this radicalism, but it was identical to those of other radical movements that bring conflict to religion and civilization everywhere. And so in this reading, or in that quote, this idea of rugged individualism, in my understanding, I also recognize that, the Latina population and culture is not a monolith, but individualism seems antithetical to, the understanding of community and community worship and community living for Latinas. And so this quote demonstrates that the heavy influence of white supremacists and sympathies in the BCC were clearly evident in their understanding. So I wanted to know how this rugged individualism impacted Baptists of then and Baptists in today in Brazil. And can you speak more on that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your remarks, and thank you for the question. Yeah. So in terms of what they are trying to do there is, and there is a long history of the Red Scare here in the US, right? Where, anything that, communism is this, thing to be resisted, and everything is communism. I remember very vividly, and this connects to this. When I was driving from Austin, where I live, to Waco, I was in seminary at Truett Seminary, Baylor University. I passed by a billboard that has Obama's picture in it, and he was like doing this, and it says "socialist by practice." It said it in the board. I will never forget this, because I could only tell that was a bad thing, because of he was clearly, the face he was making, he was supposed to be portrayed as doing something bad. Where socialism, where I grew up, in Recife, or at least amongst the people I grew up, was just a political option, right? And so socialist, to say somebody's socialist by practice is not to necessarily understand that's something bad. And I'll say that to connect to what you said, because part of what they are trying to do to say that, that these radicals, which is the name the missionaries give to the Brazilians who want to take over the power of the denomination, the administration denomination, is that they are communists. Is that they are not adopters of what they would say is the American way of life, which is this idea of meritocracy. That you have to sort of show up in life with this idea that the individual is the center of activity, not only on a personal level, but also in terms of some commitments to economic systems and the way in which things in society in general work. So that's kind of part of the sentiment that they are also trying to bring out. Is that another one is another thing that they are trying to hint at when they go on this particular kind of criticisms of the radicals, is that they are really a lot like the Roman Catholics, and that is that touches on some caricatures of Catholics that missionaries used to do. So they are trying to do all of those things at the same time. Saying that by saying that the root of all of this is anti-individualism. Is that they're really anti-progress, which for them American capitalism represents, and they are anti the best expressions of Protestantism in both Europe and the US. By still inhabiting this imagination that kind of is too close to what they would consider to be Catholic communalism, which they do not share. So they're really saying that if you go with them, you are not a true Protestant. You are just these radicals. And they go on to connect this with heresy and with all kinds of stuff. So they really want to taint the reputation of the commitments of those who they call radicals in all of those ways.
Thank you. So in chapter 5, I love that you start with how the unity of Brazilian Baptists was being disrupted by the Spirit. I love that, and for so many reasons. And one, again, like I mentioned, I grew up in the Hispanic Baptist context in Texas, and I was not aware that Pentecostalism and charismatic church was even an option. I believe one time someone said amen after the special song and had a talking to, or was given a talking to after, because heaven forbid that the Spirit, move outside of liturgy or a litany. And so, this idea that the Spirit or Pentecostalism was a threat to the unity of Baptists in Brazil. I wonder, can you talk a little bit of why you think that the idea that that Spirit-led worship or Spirit-led thinking or ideology was a threat to Baptists in Brazil?
Yeah, well, yeah. Thank you for the question. Well, I think that Baptists always used language of the Spirit, right? But this idea, the notion that they really kind of resisted to the point of kicking out a number of churches from the denomination, was the idea of the baptism of the Holy Spirit as a second blessing, right? It becomes this doctrinal kind of point of contention. And there are a few things happening here. I mean, one And it's interesting because the charismatic Baptist side of things wants to say that they are also in line with the Southern Baptist Convention, right? So they look at the Baptist Faith, Faith and Message 1963, and they say, what are you talking about? Of course that you can be Pentecostal and still be or charismatic and still believe those things. So both these groups are fighting to see who is more Baptist than the other at one point. The group that ends up winning out, which is the non-charismatic group, they have that cessationist mentality that has characterized traditional Baptist theology, and they add to that, the event that happened in 1911, when we have folks who had been influenced by William Durham in Chicago, Swedish immigrants, who go to Brazil and go to a Baptist church, because there is a Southern Baptist missionary there in Pará who is Swedish born. There is a large number of Swedish immigrants in the region of the country, and they try to take over the church, right? So that, and they ended up being kicked out, but they take some members with them. The Brazilian Assemblies of God, which is one of the largest Christian denominations in the world today, Protestant denominations in the world today, comes out of that schism. In the religious market, the Assemblies of God and Baptists were kind of always competing. So there is this theological digression, which most Baptist leaders are trained, again, translated cessationist theology written by U.S. Southern Baptists. So they really theologically think that this idea of the baptism of the Holy Spirit is wrong. As a second blessing is wrong. Now, those who end up, becoming charismatic in those churches are also influenced by a different Southern Baptist missionary, the one that, Rosalie Mills Appleby, that kind of digresses from that, and she becomes more ecumenical, and she is very much influenced by all the streams of theology, and her mentees are the ones that become leading that schism. But those who stayed the course of their convictions and ended up kicking out those churches, they are very much basing their actions in what they think, and I think they'll be right about this mostly, Southern Baptist theology tells them to do. So they are the faithful ones. The charismatic ones are the innovators, they say.
Thank you. So I have one more question. I promise, good Baptist preacher, leaving it with 3 points. So last question, third one. So there was a quote that I'm, again, pondering with this entire book and the history. But there's one particular quote that I have been pondering for the last couple of days. And it's on page 78. And it says, one must remember, however, that although this is referring to the radicals, at the beginning of the 1920s, when they're starting to, kind of start this movement of asking to be part of the leadership in Baptists in Brazil. It says, one must remember, however, that although the radical movement represented the first major local resistance against missionary white supremacy in Brazilian Baptist life, it took place mostly not in non-theological terms. Religious groups often change ideologically as a result of shifts in power structures, rather than changing power structures as a result of burgeoning ideologies. And I understand this in the context of someone who, has long been separated from Southern Baptist roots and histories. And yet so many of my mentors and teachers and preachers that I grew up with, if we played a bingo card, how many of you ever heard somebody say, I was there when they voted him out. I was there when they locked him out of his office. And, kind of referring back to this romanticized history. It's like we hold intention, we don't claim this anymore. And yet somehow we still use the same tools to operate these institutions and churches. And so, I think about this quote, and as a young leader in these denominations, as a young leader and a person of color, as a woman of color, I'm grappling with this understanding of how do we reform institutions when we're still using the same tools. And the way we think we're going to affect change is that we just continuously use the same ideology and structures, just rebranding them in different language. And so, I'm sitting with that right now. And so my question is, in light of your research, as as a Latina, a person of faith, how do you reconcile this history and the roots of it, while also being part of, being part of this, being part of what it is today? And how do you grapple with the two? And how, what is a word of hope for young leaders who are also grappling with this history of then and now?
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, and then to go back to that quote. So I was just wondering there, because it is not the explicit ambition of the locals to change theologies. They just want to change administration, right? Part of it, I suspect, it's because if they didn't present themselves that we are just like you, we just want more autonomy, but we think the same things. It's really difficult to change institutions otherwise. People talk about wanting innovation and change, but often they talk about innovation and change in institutions, especially institutions with some theological commitments, as changes in mechanisms to make them better at what they already think, right? Not as ideological changes that would challenge their convictions. So this is one of the reasons why I think these institutions change is real slow. Because, and this is what I'm trying to hint at there, is that administrative change, if it were to happen and be sustainable, and it wasn't, it could have open room for different ways of thinking. But different ways of thinking very rarely get to power quickly, and systematically. So this is what I was trying to kind of touch at in that section and what follows, the section that you read and what follows. In terms of hope, it's I am although it might not come across by reading this book, I am naturally optimistic. I am very mystic in some ways. I do believe that it is God work that we are engaged in, even as humans who are limited and sometimes just mess it up. I just hope that by learning from histories like this, we'll make better mistakes. I think some of the groups in which we are, attached to, as imperfect as they are, have committed, are committing better mistakes. So I look at the group here. I know that some already left, but I see my dear brother Ruben Ortiz here, with whom I worked before, and you, Alyssa, and also John and Andrew, who are doing wonderful work in your own lanes, and others here, that give me hope. Yes, the next generation might look back to some of what we do and say, you just messed this one up, and that's fine. But I do think that there is hope in institutions that are opening themselves up more and more to different conversations and to learning from their own histories, so that we can do better. And I think that, again, the mystic side of myself really believes that even those missionaries, as imperfect as they were, and I tried to say in the beginning of the book, listen, these people did some good things. That's not the story I'm telling, though, right? That story has been told. I'm telling the other side. So, I mean, I think that God still worked through all of this in ways that we may or may not understand, and we might only really, know in retrospect. And I only hope and trust that in a small way, we are part of that trajectory. That my role as giving the diagnostic of some of these issues might help, whoever reads it to make better mistakes, and then that the groups that have been nurtured, that have nurtured me and worked alongside of me, and many are here, we make each other better, but not perfect. That's the thing, right? We always need forgiveness and grace, and as did these folks that I wrote about in the book. But there are many good things that they did too.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alyssa and Joao. Really great conversation. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. If anyone would like to ask either Joao or Alyssa or both. Don't be too shy. Yeah, Andrew.
Hi, thanks so much for a really fascinating talk. I wanted to ask a question just about the very last phase of this history that you talked about briefly, the relationship to the Christian right in the United States. So this question is really motivated by my own dissertation, which picks up and looks at the International Mission Board in the 1980s and 90s. And one of the things I hear from missionaries all the time is that in that period, the impact of the conservative resurgence really damaged missionaries' relationships to Latin American conventions as they were pivoting to a more direct evangelism-based approach. And I have talked to missionaries who are told not to interact with existing churches in Latin America because they were spiritually dead, and the Southern Baptist Convention needed to create new partnerships and new relationships in these countries. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how that played out in Brazil, and then also in this relationship to the Christian right and this international dynamic between Brazil and the United States. How much is the International Mission Board currently a player in connecting American religious right figures to Brazilian Baptists, and how much of that connection is mediated through other either non-denominational or quasi-denominational entities?
Thank you. That is a wonderful question. Well, a couple of things that a distinction that perhaps was already implied in your question, but I will just follow through with. It's like the international mission boards and field missionaries don't always agree, right? So one example is, and I didn't emphasize that I was saying, was during the transition on power when the radical movement won for like a decade. Missionaries were really upset with the Foreign Mission Board, because the Foreign Mission Board sided with the locals and the missionaries wanted them to just not, right? So later on, they bring the FMB, now IMB, around, but so I think that distinction is just important to, to make. In terms of the, if you read the periodicals in Brazil during the religious right and during the either conservative takeover, or the fundamentalist takeover of or conservative resurgence, whatever is your cup of tea here. What you see is really a praise for the most conservative side of the spectrum. I understand there is a distinction between that and the moral majority, for example, which but there are also studies, and I hear can remember Ivan Diaz, who's he's a president of a seminary in Brazil, but wrote a wonderful a book on the way in which Brazilian Baptist leaders really sided with either explicit or implicitly with the dispositions of the moral majority. Now, you have to remember one thing in terms of Brazil is that the dictatorship goes until 1985. So there's really no democratic voice until then. And then even after then, we're still coming out of a dictatorship where Protestants are in Brazil are really they become kind of being elected to offices and all that, but their representation actually in some of these in Congress and the Senate really becomes stronger after the 90s. And by then, the way in which influence comes about for the Brazilian Baptists and others is really diversified, right? So sometimes is, this sister church model that, and I think that touches on some of what you said, that is not even more direct influence has become, less so. It become like seminary partnerships are one of the strongest form of direct influence. So the leaders being trained in Southern Baptist seminaries, and then going back and leading institutions there, that still happens. Partnerships are signed and ongoing. But then the sister church model sometimes also does some of that direct influence today in terms of the International Mission Board kind of inserting some more intentional influence for Brazil, but I don't think it happens as much. I will tell a story though that I think touches on that. I was in a meeting not too long ago, and a president of a Baptist institution in the US, knowing there was Brazilian and Baptist, assumed I was part of the majority and was a supporter of Bolsonaro. And he came to me and he showed me a picture of him and Bolsonaro in Brazil. That's a president of a US institution. And he said, no, I was praying for him there. I hope they are. Of course, I just heard it. It's fine. I mean, that's not my particular disposition. But and then he said something very interesting. He said, lots of Brazilian pastors send their kids to do their undergrads with us. So you have that pipeline happening, not only in terms of seminaries, but that kind of happens in more diversified. So there is that stream of direct influence is still there. And then we still have some missionaries teaching in schools there, but not as much. So it has diversified the way in which influence is manifested, but it remains sustainable to an extent. But again, the most clearly direct influence is via theological training. Does that answer your question, Andrew?
Yes, thank you so much. That's fantastic and really, really rich and interesting.
Appreciate that.
Great. Thank you all so much. Well, I think we are almost right at time. So if we'd like to give if we have, I see we have one more question. All right. If we can make it try and quick to respect everyone's time, Ruben, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Joao. I just want to say thank you for your book. We need more of that on the influence of the missionaries in Latin America, and also how we are seeing now the boomerang of all that theology in our institutions and our churches. As a Latino field coordinator for CBF, I have just a quick question. It's about how do you see the present controversy with Ed René Krivitz, pastor of Agua Branca is the church, and the Council of Pastors, the leadership of pastors, not necessarily the convention, not necessarily the churches, but the Council of Pastors. How do you see that related with the history you've been telling us?
Well, thank you very much. As a matter of fact, Ed René Krivitz, for those of you who don't know, is a very well-known Brazilian pastor of Igreja Batista de Água Branca in São Paulo. And he was actually wrote one of the blurbs for my book in Portuguese, so I'm partial here. But what happened was that he, in a sermon, he says that we have to, to understand the Bible contextually. He was talking about reading in between the lines of Scripture, our hermeneutics that is contextual. And I forgot the exact term he used, but he was kicked out of the state order of pastors in São Paulo. And then, he's still there, still thriving. Nobody left the church, but some of the pastor, the leadership of the state convention said he wasn't Baptist enough to be with them, basically. I don't think anyone was surprised by that necessarily, Ruben, because although Rene is very much, by many standards, I would call him a very conservative pastor theologically, but he has a social edge to him. He has this conversation with Misión Integral, and that's very controversial within Brazilian evangelicalism in general. Again, sometimes being accused of communism. So I think that it was not necessarily surprising, but it was also the outcome of a number of things that had been accumulating over the years. Being that he became really has become really strong pastor and has drifted into theological waters, conversing with liberation theology. I know, and defending the Workers' Party in some ways. One of his pastors is now out, but he was an avid defender of the Workers' Party, which is the party that goes against Bolsonaro. So there has been a buildup, and then he said something that they picked up. Oh, he doesn't believe in that the Bible is literally true. Like that was where they picked it up. So he doesn't believe in the kind of the literalist biblicist hermeneutics. So let's just kick him out on that. And he reaffirmed what he had signed in his commitments. And I believe all those things, but they said, no, you don't. And he was still kicked out.
Thank you. I think he mentioned that we need to rewrite some of the passages. That was
something like that. That's right.
Very interesting controversy, right now.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. I just want to, this was a great event. If we could all give our speakers a Zoom round of applause, thanking them for their time. I would just like to point you all to our next webinar. You can register at this link. It's on July 7th, and we'll feature the work of Dr. Nicole Myers-Turner, Soul Liberty, the Evolution of Black Religious Politics in Post-Emancipation Virginia, and will be hosted at the First Baptist Church of Hampton, Virginia, virtually hosted. So please sign up for July 7th. Hope to see you there. And thank you all for joining tonight. Have a good night.
Thank you all. Thank you.